Oh, hi. Sorry, I didn't see you there. I was just listening to my music collection. Speaking of which, last week on Why Music, we turned moving waves into standing waves. You see, your average instrument could be described as just a medium. A medium is something that carries waves, with two boundaries, one on either end. Waves bounce between these two boundaries at a specific frequency. Now, if we added waves into that medium at that exact frequency, all the waves that we put in, the moving waves, will bounce, interact with each other, and create this one thing moving up and down called a standing wave. Now, some of you may have watched that episode and went, is that how instruments work in real life? Indeed. Enjoy the show. A concerned citizen asks, how pitch? Right, last week we covered the concept of resonance, that certain media can have resonant frequencies, but that still begs the question, what's physically happening when you play a real instrument? Well, first off, what determines the resonant frequency of any of these strings, for example? We know that a resonant frequency always adds a new wave by the time the last one has reflected. So another way to ask that would be how much time passes between reflections of a wave. That's time. That's the first variable. But in order to figure out time, we need to know the answer to two more variables. There's distance, which is just how far does a wave have to travel to get from end to end. That's really easy. That's just the length of the string. And then there's rate. How quickly does a wave move through any medium? For a string, it's determined by a couple of things. We got thickness and material. You can see that the thickness of each string is changing. And there's also tension. So if I turned one of the knobs up here, that would tighten or loosen the string, and therefore change how quickly a wave can move through it. Put all of that together and you get the answer to time, and therefore you get the answer to the resonant frequency of any of these strings. Now, once you start bowing a string, that's going to be wiggling back and forth, right? At the exact midpoint, which is right here, it's the easiest to do that. I can wiggle it pretty freely with little resistance. But then the closer I get to one of these fixed points, the harder it becomes to move it, the more force I have to exert to get it to move at all. This point doesn't want to move, so I'm fighting the tension of this spot. But then, of course, the middle being the farthest away from either of these two fixed points, that's the spot where it moves the most freely. Now, let's look at some slowed down footage of a string being bowed.
A bow is made to be sticky. Watch, as the bow moves, it brings the string along with it. But there comes a point where the bow can't take it any further, and all that tension that was building up is finally released. The string slips free of the bow, snaps back to where it wants to be, equilibrium. Of course, because of all that tension, it ends up going too far in the other direction, and so it has to stop and go back. But now the bow and string are moving in the same direction again, so they stick together, and the cycle starts over. This is called Slipstick Motion. Nice. Okay, but hold on. There's no standing waves. Why does resonance even matter if instruments don't actually vibrate like we expect them to?
Earlier we were using these wire waves with the neat little curves, but a bow can't really have that much finesse. When a bow pulls against a string, it creates a harsh angle, separating the string into two lines. And then once it slips, that kink starts moving down the string. Because it's still a wave, it just doesn't look as pretty as the ones we've been dealing with. Now remember, it's really hard to wiggle a string back and forth nearer to the fixed points. Once you get closer to the middle, it takes less energy to get the string to move. So all of that tension from the bow, from right here, becomes more and more effective the closer to the middle we get, and then less and less effective once we get to the end. That wave reflects like any wave would, comes back in the other direction. And this cycle continues to repeat with the bow adding more energy to stop the wave from decaying over time. Do you recognize that shape? Isn't that just a standing wave? So a string isn't wiggling in the shape of a standing wave, but over time it's like tracing the outline of a standing wave? Yes, that is what's happening. This is called Helmholtz Motion. And it's really weird because now the midpoint of a string is way more important.
It used to be just that it was equidistant from either of the two nodes. So if there were waves traveling from either end, they would meet in the middle. But also, this weird thing about tension and motion means that the midpoint is the spot with the highest motion. So this standing wave shape is facilitated by both the interference of waves and the weird tension of a string. Let's do one more experiment with the thread, but instead of focusing on the kink moving back and forth, let's glue our eyes to this point right here. The kink is going to keep moving to the right, but this spot is moving down gradually. And then once the kink reaches right here, this is the lowest that this spot will ever move. If you were to make a graph showing the position of just that point on the string over time, it would look like a mathematically perfect sine wave. Because sine wave isn't just a made-up word. Sine is a function in trigonometry. Sine has to do with right triangles. And a bow effectively turns the string into two right triangles. At any given point, trigonometry reflects the shape of a string. So the sine function is accurately describing the position of any of these points on the string. So every single point on this string is moving up and down with its own little sine wave. It has a different amplitude, and maybe the peaks and valleys come at different times, but it always is a sine wave of the same frequency.
I get that all the math checks out, but it's still weird to me that music is triangles. I feel like it should be circles or something. Anyway, that was how a string moves, but of course there are other kinds of instruments too. Excuse me while I go and practice.
Imagine a crowded tunnel, and on one end, a stream of people is passing by. There isn't really room for anyone in this tunnel, but some of the people get caught on the lip. They get caught in the wall, and they kind of force their way into the entrance. It's way too cramped right here, so everyone is pushing back in every direction. Some of the people who tried to get in get thrown back out, and the stream is redirected away from the entrance. But it's too late, because as we know, shoving people in a crowded place starts a chain reaction as people get shoved into the person next to them, and so on. Eventually, a whole bunch of folks at the other end get thrown out of the tunnel. But hold on. Now there's this empty space at the end. Few of the people come back in, but everybody take a step forward. Perfect. Oh wait, but now there's room at the entrance again, and the people are starting to come back. Oh, come on. The cycle begins again. This cycle repeats periodically. It takes a set amount of time for the shoving to reach the exit, and it takes that exact same amount of time for everyone in the tunnel to step forward. In other words, this process has a specific frequency. Now, in your mind, substitute people for air molecules, substitute the tunnel for a pipe, and speed up the entire process by a whole lot. This is pitch in an open pipe. It's how a flute works, for example. You blow over one end. That's the stream of people. The flute is a medium with two boundaries where waves invert when they reflect. And so if we applied resonance to this, where we added waves on one end at the exact resonant frequency of the flute, we would get a standing wave of pressure that looks an awful lot like the shape of a standing wave on a rope. But also, what? Because a rope has hard boundaries, and the reason that there are nodes at the ends is because they're fixed. They just can't move. How could you describe the boundaries of a flute as being hard? That doesn't make any sense. It seems like a paradox, but the answer to it comes from the age-old question, what are we measuring? What's the y-axis? For this one, the y-axis is pressure. If we made a new graph, and we made the y-axis motion instead, we would actually get a standing wave that looks like the standing wave in water. Antinodes at the ends and a node in the middle. Because here's the weird thing, motion alleviates pressure. How could you have air pressure at the end of a pipe when that air could just as easily flow out into the atmosphere? Imagine we're back in that tunnel, and instead of pressure, the y-axis is instead, how hard is it to get to that bathroom on the outside? If you're at the end, you could just walk out. But if you're in the middle, there's all these people that you have to push against and fight through until you can finally get to the outside. So in an open pipe, you have pressure, which has nodes at the ends, and you have motion, which has antinodes at the ends. But we're not talking about resonance anyway. You can only blow air over the end of the flute. You can only add more pressure. You can't make waves of low pressure. So what we have is the same thing as a bow. One wave moving back and forth at the resonant frequency of the flute. But it becomes harder to go to the bathroom the closer to the middle of the tunnel you get. So, also just like the bow, that one wave changes in amplitude as it goes back and forth along the flute.
So, how pitch? It isn't resonance, weirdly enough. If we could make an instrument resonate, then we would be making that pitch ourselves, which is why we need a thing that resonates in the first place. But all the stuff we learned about resonance, uniform wavelengths, standing waves, is relevant in all of music. Pitch in instruments is just one wave moving back and forth, but it's at the same rate and with the same contour as a standing wave. Thanks for watching. Please like this video, and if you want to keep up with the series, then subscribe for a new episode every Thursday.